Thanks, Jen. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today, The Game Plan, Framing the Plan Giving Conversation. My name is Nathan Stelter, president here at the Stelter Company, and happy to be here to introduce our presenters. I hope we are finding everyone safe and healthy during this crazy times. As always, as an industry leader, Stelter is committed to providing innovative solutions and education for industry, and we're always happy to host this complimentary webinar series in our webinar today. Today's webinar is actually our fifth of our 2020 slate. Last one about a month or so ago. Everything blends together nowadays, but was around legacy challenges. And then we did, as you would imagine, add one on CARES Act and COVID-19, both of which can be found on stelter.com/webinars. But we're also blessed with some other presenters along with our great duo today. But Pamela Anderson will be giving us a webinar here in the coming months on cues and clues on what your prospects are telling you and what you need to say in return. Catherine Myrie will also join us to teach you how to design the perfect marketing strategy for your gift planning program. And Dr. Russell James will share his most recent observations of baby boomers. So all those, again, will be available to sign up for and register on our stelter.com/webinars. But as we get closer to the date, if you are on our list, we will make sure to email you accordingly. So back to our presentation today. Again, we've got two great presenters, the first of which is Robert King. Bob and I have known each other for some time. He's the National Director of Gift Planning and Senior Philanthropic Advisor for Children International down in Kansas City, Missouri. In this role, Bob leads the organization's efforts to provide donors at the highest level of support for their charitable interests and priorities by providing information and advice on charitable giving options and helping translate their ideas into a personalized plan of action that accomplishes their goals. Bob joined Children International in December of 2018 after a great career down at University of Houston, where he was there 2014 to 2018 in a couple different roles, most recent of which being a Senior Director of Advancement at the C.T. Bauer College of Business, where he was the architect of the Here We Go, from credible to incredible, the college's $120 million portion of that $1 billion capital campaign. Also spending some time in gift planning there, as well as Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. Before entering this great field of charitable gift planning, Bob worked in the state administration at Northern Trust, as well as Senior VP and Senior Trust Officer at Farmers in Galesburg. He's a good Midwestern boy with a bachelor's from Illinois Wesleyan and a JD from Illinois Institute Technology, Chicago School of Law. Is licensed to practice law in Illinois, as well as a member of our National Association Charitable Gift Planners Leadership Institute. If you're not part of that, it is a great organization, and the Mid-American Gift Planning Council, and a fellow in charitable estate planning. Dahlia actually joins us from the University of Houston. She's been a part of that community for quite a while, since 2002, and has been with the Bauer College since 2006. In her current role as Director of Advancement, she's responsible for supporting the college in creating and nurturing relationships with individual donors and corporate partners, and overseeing various fundraising initiatives. She also serves in her free time, if she has some, as an adjunct faculty member in the Department of Marketing and Entrepreneurship, teaching MBA Business Communications. Prior to her role, she had a couple different roles throughout the school, as Director of Admissions and Marketing, responsible for marketing, admissions, and recruitment-related efforts, as well as working closely with the UH community and student-run organizations. Prior to joining Bauer, Dahlia worked in student affairs at the University of Houston, College of Optometry, and the University of Houston Clear Lake, where she holds a master's in cross-cultural studies and a bachelor's she received prior to at University of Texas in Austin. So that's two very accomplished speakers, two terrific individuals sharing some information. I will turn it over to Bob and Dahlia.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nathan, and thank you, Jen. And thank you all for spending some time with us today. Dahlia and I hope you'll take away some pointers and ideas that'll help with the plan giving conversation and perspective and help you start and continue that conversation with your donors. So full disclosure time, this presentation has its origins from my time in Texas, where football is life. And I originally started this presentation with a clip from the TV series Friday Night Lights, and it featured a montage of Coach Eric Taylor giving his best motivational speeches and finishing with the greatest catchphrase ever: clear eyes, full hearts, can't lose. So I really intended it to be a fun way to frame the plan giving conversation around football terms and around being part of a winning team. And since it got a good reception, no pun intended, I've kept on using the game planning theme ever since then. But, you know, in light of current events and obviously the sobering news that we get almost on a minute-by-minute basis, it got me thinking, you know, is this the wrong time to talk about plan giving as a game? In fact, is it the wrong time to talk about plan giving at all? You know, we're facing the greatest world health crisis in over a century. So you ask yourself, is it wrong to talk about something that's usually associated with death? And as I thought about it, I had to say this: absolutely not. This is absolutely not the wrong time to be talking about plan giving. In fact, I think this is a time when the plan giving discussion makes the most sense. So Dahlia and I want to share with you a quote from Professor Brene Brown of the University of Houston, because we think it really gets at the heart of what many people are feeling right now and probably will be feeling for the next couple months. And the quote is, "Vulnerability is the birthplace of courage. And if we want to be brave, we have to be real." And we like this quote because, you know, at this point, we all need to acknowledge that in the current situation, we are all feeling some degree of vulnerability, which is not a bad thing. I'm confident in saying that within the last 2 months, likely 99% of us and our donors have asked ourselves sensitive questions that start with two powerful words. What if? What if I get sick? What if a loved one gets sick? Or what if things go from bad to worse? Questions like these, you know, are unsettling because they're reminders of our vulnerability and our mortality. But at the same time, we need to remember that vulnerability is the crucible where trust is forged. So this is really a time to be real with our donors. It's a time when we can establish and build trust in one another. It's a time to reaffirm our core values and strengthen the belief in the mission and purpose of our organizations and their place in the world. It's a time to share thoughts and stories that make us feel grounded and remind us that human connections truly matter. And it's really a time to face our vulnerability, to be brave, to be real, and to answer those what if questions with honesty and with purpose. So yes, this is the right time to be having the plan giving conversation with our donors. So with that in mind, and in the spirit of the recently completed NFL draft, we're going to get started by making all of you first round draft choices of team plan giving, because we think you've got what it takes to have a winning plan giving conversation with your donors. So to get us fired up, say it with me if you want: clear eyes, full hearts, can't lose. So with that, we're going to do a walkthrough right now, as any good coaching session starts with. So here's what we're going to cover in today's session. We're going to start with our team meeting. We're going to talk about getting geared up for the game, and I'll go into more about what I mean when I talk about this as a game. We're going to talk about knowing the playing field. In this part, we're going to get into something that's having the biggest impact on philanthropy these days. From there, we're going to dive into the fundamentals. We're going to talk about this when we'll actually get into talk about framing that plan giving conversation. And then last but not least, we're going to put it all together, and we're going to hear from Dahlia, our team captain, and she's going to talk about her experience being a relatively new person to fundraising, and especially new to plan giving. So let's talk about getting geared up for the game. What do I mean when we talk about why are we talking about this as a game in the first place? So what I talk about as the game, I'm really talking about donor-centric philanthropy. And why is donor-centric philanthropy a game? Well, when we think about it, a game usually has rules, it has objectives, and it has a goal. For the most part, the rules are the accepted guidelines for engaging in contact with others who are participating in the game. An objective is usually to score more points than your opponent, and the goal of any game really is to win. So in a way, donor-centric philanthropy has all of these elements. They're just defined differently and applied differently. So let's talk about the rules first for donor-centric philanthropy. So the rules for this game, there's 3 basic rules, and they're pretty straightforward. The rules are asking respectful questions, listening to learn, and following through. As for an objective, from our standpoint, we're looking at arriving at a values-based legacy gift. That's a triple win. It's a win for our donor, it's a win for our institution, and really it's a win for the ultimate beneficiary of the donor's generosity. And then last but not least, our game of donor-centric philanthropy has a goal. is to make our donor feel like the most valuable philanthropist, right? So going on from there, I want to touch on one more aspect of the game. And this comes to that question that we keep seeing on occasion. Are we talking about planned giving or are we talking about gift planning? I think we use them interchangeably, but I really kind of want to focus on planned giving for a second, because I think this is going to be important as we obviously move forward. So let's think about this from two perspectives. And the first perspective is from a fundraiser's perspective. So what's the most common impression associated with the term planned giving from a fundraiser's perspective? And I'm going to say that when you first got into fundraising and you first heard about planned giving, it was complicated, right? So I've kind of reduced this to an equation so we can keep it in mind. So it starts out as a simple equation thinking, okay, planned giving is complicated, but it's a little bit more than that. Planned giving is usually about personal finances. It's about assets. It's about complex arrangements and lawyers and spending money and taxes and accountants and spending more money. So we can see where that planned giving really does seem like something that's complicated from our perspective. Then if we switch it around, think of it from the donor's perspective, what's the most common impression associated with the term planned giving? Well, I think we've already covered that. It's unfortunately the concept of death, right? And this too has its own equation. So when we talk about planned giving, it's usually associated with bequests. We're talking about bequests, which come in through a will. And if we're talking about a will, we're almost certainly talking about death. So with that in mind, from those two different perspectives, is it better to use the term gift planning instead to get away from those impressions? Well, as with anything, there's two sides to that answer. There's pro planned giving and there's pro gift planning. So I'll let you take a look at these slides a little bit later on and see what folks on either side are saying. But here's where I'm going to come out on all of this. It doesn't really matter whatever we call it, if we're going to call it planned giving or gift planning, because we're going to change the equation. So from a fundraiser's perspective, we're going to take complicated out of the equation and we're going to replace it with something else. We're going to say that planned giving or gift planning is about asking and listening and following through. We're going to substitute our three basic rules of of donor-centric philanthropy into the equation from a fundraising standpoint. So don't think of it as something that's complicated. Think of it in terms of asking, listening, and following through. Likewise, from our donor's perspective, we're going to change the equation. We're going to get away from talking about bequests and getting that connotation of death, and we're going to change the equation. We're going to add values, both the donor's values and the values of your organization, and we're going to add purpose, the donor's purpose for giving and the organization's purpose for what they do. Because if we can combine those two, we're going to turn planned giving into something that's about legacy more so than just about bequests. So our ultimate goal with all of this is to change our approach to the planned giving conversation. So we'll wrap up our team meeting now and we'll go on to knowing the playing field, or talking about something that's having the biggest impact on philanthropy. So for this, I want you to think about our playing field. I want you to think about philanthropy as the playing field where we do our fundraising. So it's where we engage our donors and it's where we're trying to have the most impact. So from that perspective, what's having the biggest impact on philanthropy? Is it taxes? Is it economic conditions? Or is there something else at play? So again, my take on this is really what's having the biggest impact on philanthropy is the evolving expectations of our donors. And to put it more succinctly, it's the emergence of donors who think and act more like investors. Donors really do have the same expectations as investors. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's compare what donors and investors have in common, what they both want. So from this perspective, let's take a look at the first piece. What do investors and donors both want? They want information and insight from professionals. They want those professionals to understand them, and they want professionals to help them achieve their financial commitments, or what they want to achieve through their financial commitments. Investors and donors also want that same professional to provide them with sound advice and the best options for achieving their goals. What else do they want in common? Donors and investors both want to know how an organization plans to accomplish its own goals and how it plans to achieve superior results. From that, donors and investors want to see that connection between an organization's results and the positive impact that they expect will come from those results. Then last but not least, investors and donors both want something substantial in return for their financial commitment that they make. For the investor, the return is really increased personal wealth through capital appreciation, dividends, reinvestment growth. From the donor standpoint, it's something is valuable, but the return is really the personal satisfaction in knowing that their deeply held values are reflected in the work of the organization, and that those values are going to be carried through into the future through the organization's work. So if we think about it from that perspective, in a very real sense, philanthropy is part of the service industry, and it's made up of organizations looking for long-term investors. So how do we turn this understanding of what our playing field is into something we can use? How do we make this information part of the game plan? Well, let's think about this. The charitable giving conversation is going to come down to two things, and we'll call these two things our plays. We're going to run two basic plays and keep our playbook very simple. The first play we're going to run is discovering why and how a donor's values align with the mission of the organization. And then from there, we're just going to run the second play, which is understanding what needs to be done to help a donor make the most of their support through good advice, good options, and focusing on the outcomes of their support and the impact that it'll have. So that covers those first two aspects, and let's really kind of dive into the fundamentals. So this is where we're going to start getting into framing the conversation, the productive plan giving conversation. So let's talk about the fundamental aspects of donor-centric philanthropy, okay? We'll start off with the first one. The first aspect is commitment to developing long-term relationships. Now, this one, again, may seem very simple, very basic, but that's why it's fundamental. So let's think about that traditional benchmark that we have from a gift planning, from a major gift standpoint, where we're talking about anywhere between 12 to 18 months to secure a gift from a donor. So when we think long-term, it's at least a year. We're talking about a relationship with a donor, and then it goes really beyond that. So it's really committing to carrying those relationships forward as long as possible. The second aspect that we're talking about is curiosity and developing your curiosity. So this is really kind of understanding your donor. So again, to use a quote that's kind of relates this, I tend to think of Stephen Covey's quote about seek first to understand, then be understood. That's a great place to start when we talk about curiosity. And really from a curiosity standpoint, let's think about it in terms of moves management. So we can think of this as the cultivation step. And so where we're really engaging our curiosity is we're really developing a genuine interest in understanding our donor. And then last but not least, the third aspect of donor-centric philanthropy is focusing on having productive conversations. And within that, it's focusing on the why, how, and what of having a productive conversation. So we're going to turn the three rules of donor-centric philanthropy into 3 steps for framing the plan giving conversation. So before we dive into those, let's start with these first two. I want to talk a little bit more about the first two fundamental aspects of donor-centric philanthropy. So let's talk about commitment and curiosity. Now, stay with me on this one. I'm going to switch to basketball, because in basketball, there's an old adage that you can't coach height, right? And that's just a way of saying that you come to the game with certain fixed qualities that aren't likely to change no matter the amount of influence a coach tries to have on that aspect of your game. So in a way, the same thing can be said for the commitment to developing long-term relationships. The willingness and desire to engage in developing long-term relationships is something that every successful fundraiser has to bring to the game themselves. A coach can provide instruction and motivation, whether negative or positive, and try to bring about the actions that support developing long-term relationships. But the reality is, only you as a fundraiser can tap into some internal drive to pursue those type of relationships. And like height in basketball, if you have it, it gives you an advantage that's going to serve you well in your endeavors. So let's talk a little bit about curiosity. Now, for anyone who knows me and who's been in one of my offices since 2008, they've likely seen this infographic hanging on the wall. And for me, it's always been a great reminder of the traits and skills and abilities that we as fundraisers should continually seek to develop and hone in order to be the best representatives of our organizations and to provide our donors with the highest level of service in helping them reach their philanthropic goals. This is also my reminder to look for these aspects in prospective employees, and that great fundraisers can come from many different walks of life and from different fields. So as you think about your engagement efforts with donors, I encourage you to keep this infographic handy and review it from time to time to remind yourself of the skills and abilities that you exceed in, and also where you can seek to improve. Now, I can make this available to anybody, but the fastest way to find it is if you Google Education Advisory Board and type in Curious Chameleon, you're going to get the PDF of this infographic. And I think it's just, again, it's one of the best things to have, just as a reminder to you, and some things to really strive for. So from there, let's talk about, that brings us to the third fundamental aspect of donor-centric philanthropy and the main point of the presentation. It's framing that productive plan giving conversation. And again, we're going to focus on the why, how, and what. So let's think back to the rules of the game that we talked about. Those rules really become our steps in framing the conversation. So rule number one, asking respectful, thoughtful questions, that becomes that why aspect of what we're going to talk about. That second rule, listening to learn to align values and mission, that becomes our how. And then lastly, our third rule, following through on donor expectations, that becomes our what. All right. One more thing before we dive into the steps for framing the conversation. I just want to take a minute to acknowledge the work that Dr. Russell James and his team of researchers are doing to continually explore the neuroscience of philanthropy. If you spent any time on the plan giving side of charitable giving, or if you're experienced in charitable giving, you've undoubtedly heard of Russell James and the amazing body of work that he has done to help all of us understand the connection between charitable giving and human physiology. If you're new to plan giving or new to fundraising, you need to become familiar with his work. Now, I mentioned Russell's work and the physiological aspects of charitable giving because it's important to remember that when we're talking to our donors, there's so much more going on in their minds than just evaluating whether or not to give to our organizations. There's a thought process taking place during the conversation that goes much deeper. So it's going to serve you well if you remember the following. And again, it's going to be another quote. We are not thinking machines that feel, we are feeling machines that think. Now, this quote from Dr. Damasio of USC, it's a simple but pretty powerful statement, and one we should return to over and over again as we think about how to engage our donors and supporters. At its essence, it's a reminder that whatever information we're processing, our emotions will always have a central role in our assessment, whether we want them to or not. So we need to take into account which emotions our donors are tapping into when we talk to them about supporting our organizations. So keeping that emotional filter of human thought process in mind, let's talk about the first step in framing the plan giving conversation. So the objective of the why step, which again is the asking respectful, thoughtful questions. The objective in this step is to uncover the motivations, both the stated motivations and unstated motivations for a donor's actions. And that's to gain insight or to gain a sense of their values, or to put another way, to understand the emotional guidelines that they use, that our donors are using in making their decisions. So we may know some facts about our donor, but until we know the why behind those facts, we can only guess at what those motivations are, right? So the why aspect of this part of the conversation really kind of gives you insights into a donor's mindset, which in one way or another is going to be tied to one or more emotions, okay? We're those feeling machines that think. So our mindset's going to be tied to our emotions. Why is this important? Well, if we understand a donor's emotions and we understand their mindset, where they're coming from, we can put those together and really understand the donor's values, all right? And that's a key step to figuring out what we're going to do from a giving standpoint. So let me just give you a quick example. So for those of us in higher ed fundraising, if you see the fact that a donor gave a gift in memory of a classmate, it might be something out of the ordinary. They may be giving to another aspect, but they all of a sudden here's a gift in memory of a classmate. You know, that's a question that you're going to want to dive into and know, what about it? What about this gift? What about this classmate inspired this gift? You know, what about their time on campus together was so special? What is the donor's inner criteria for making that gift? You know, could it mean that the donor really values the idea of legacy, that they appreciate the bonds of students, you know, the bonds that students form during their time together? Maybe they have an interest in supporting programs and activities that really help create lifelong friendships. So it's words like that. It's exploring like legacies and bonds and lifelong friendships. We're trying to get through just what the action was and trying to understand it from a real basic perspective. So as we think about this, let's talk about some coaching tips for the why portion of framing the conversation. So I want you to think in terms of algebra. And this part of the conversation is like algebra, but instead of solving for X, you're trying to solve for Y. Now, at this part of the conversation, when you're framing the conversation, not all of your questions that you're going to ask a donor to try to find out their motivations are not going to start with why. A lot of times it's going to start with a statement such as, I noticed that you gave a gift in honor of a classmate. Could you tell me a little bit more about why you gave that gift? Could you tell me a little bit more about that classmate? And the last coaching tip in this area is that you'll know you've discovered a donor's core value, or you'll really understand that you've discovered their emotional guidelines for acting when you no longer have to ask why. You'll understand that donor at a level where you'll know where they're thinking, that you'll see where that alignment comes into play. So let's move on to the second step in framing the plan giving conversation. It's the how, or the listening to learn. The objective of this step is to be able to answer one question. How does everything I've uncovered about the donor's values or their emotional guidelines, how does that align with the reason our organization exists and what we're trying to accomplish? So in other words, you're really trying to get at how does everything I've heard about the donor's values align with the mission of the organization? So that's really what we're trying to do at this point. So an important part of this part of the conversation is you're going to phrase this in a way that you want to understand what words the donor is using to talk about their values, or when they answer those questions, you're trying to understand how those values are matching up with the words that you use to talk about your mission. Because at a very basic level, when the donor is talking in the same words, in the same language about themselves as about the mission of your organization, that's when you really see that alignment coming into play. You're also wondering about the elements of the core programs that you have. Again, how is the donor talking about what's important to them? How does that match up with your vision of the future? So what we're really trying to get at are, again, two pieces to this equation. When you're talking about an organization's mission and you see the values alignment, you can put those together and you can see that there's a common purpose between the donor and the organization. Now, as far as coaching tips for this step, I want you to keep in mind that our definition of plan giving going forward is values plus purpose equals legacy. So when we understand the why, when we understand the values, and we get to the purpose, now we're onto the legacy conversation. We can start that conversation. It's also a key when you're talking to a donor to listen for words like perpetuate, preserve, continue, carry on, lasting, or to even introduce those words to the donor to see what the reaction is. Because when you can hear those words, you know that donors are thinking beyond their lifetime and thinking about what happens afterwards. And don't be afraid to use words like legacy or future. Donors are expecting that. If they know that you're there to talk about your support of the organization, or their support of the organization in the future, they're going to understand what that is about. So don't be afraid to use legacy, future, or words that are in the future. Lastly, the last coaching tip here is to resist the urge to get to the what until you're clear on the why and how. So a lot of times you'll hear something in a conversation and you might immediately think, wow, that would be great to set up a charitable remainder trust, or that would be a good, I hear the cue for a charitable gift annuity. Resist that urge to jump into that discussion until you're really clear on the why and how, until you're really clear on the values and you're really clear on the purpose aspect. So our final step in framing the plan giving conversation is the what, and this is the follow through on donors' expectations. So what we're really trying to get at here, the objective for this step is to have a clear line of sight into what success looks like from the donor's perspective. We're thinking of this in another way to understand the donor's intentions so well that you can reduce them to a written expression that can serve as the foundation for a gift agreement. So answering the accomplishment question is important because it leads to the discussion about outcomes, which allows you to talk about impact, which is really, again, what a donor is looking for. So what we're trying to do with the impact, we're trying to find out from the donor, what does impact look like from your perspective? Is it something that we can measure? Is it, say, graduating a number of students or providing, a certain amount of X for the recipients? Or is it something that needs to be demonstrated, as in we have a lot of kids who end up, going through programs where they learn to wash their hands, like we have here at Children International. So you're really trying to define what impact looks like. And then from there, you're trying to figure out, okay, if I understand what the donor wants to accomplish, what their impact is, what are the available options for delivering that? And how do we do that in the most efficient, effective way? So here's some coaching tips for the what portion of the conversation. Keep in mind that this is the proposal building portion of the conversation. So again, once you know the why and the how, you can get to the what. And this is where you're really building the proposal for your donor. One aspect, if you look on the Curious Chameleon form, you'll see something about not taking rejection personally. The rejection of proposals, don't take it personally. If you frame the conversation correctly and you understand, again, the why and the how, chances are you're going to build a proposal that's not going to be rejected. So keep that in mind. The what phase of the conversation really also creates the opportunity to collaborate with subject matter experts, which again really kind of falls into that investor model. Because if you can use subject matter experts, and by that I'm thinking of decision makers, like if you're in higher ed, a dean or a professor, or if you're at a not-for-profit organization, someone from the leadership who can really talk about that vision and the mission of the organization, if you can bring them into that conversation when we're working on the what, that really cements the feeling that the donor is a part of the organization and has a stake in the future. So this is a great opportunity to introduce those subject matter experts. Then last but not least, if you can do this well, if you can be very clear up front with what a donor's intentions are, you're eliminating a problem down the road for your organization. So keep that in mind, that's why that clarity piece is so important. So with that, let me just go into a couple quick general coaching tips. Here's the first tip. I think it's important that you listen and learn from some of the best minds in plan giving. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip ahead to another slide here and show this to you. Here are some recorded webinars on the Stelter website and 2 that are upcoming. And here's my coaching tip. I want you to go back to the Stelter website when you have time in the coming weeks and look at each one of these webinars and download the materials with these webinars, because I think you'll really start to see how this pulls together. So if you think in terms of framing the conversation, you'll notice that a couple of these webinars actually go into the actual conversation itself. So you'll actually get some of the questions to ask. So again, that's where downloading the material will be very helpful, because it'll allow you to think about how to plan your visits with your donors. So by all means, watch the Great Coaches webinars on Stelter's website. Then the second general coaching tip that I have for everyone is if you're not comfortable with the idea of setting up a plan giving conversation with a donor, start to practice by talking to donors who already have a planned gift with your organization. Right? It's the best way to practice that. So you can ask your plan giving office or your teammates for a recommendation, and maybe even set up a joint visit, or at this point a joint call with a donor who already has a planned gift, because generally speaking, they're going to want to talk to you. So you're going to want to talk to them about what really makes a planned gift meaningful to you. Why did you decide this was the best opportunity? That's a great way for you to practice your conversations with donors and get some real feedback from them. So putting it all together, and before I turn everything over to Dahlia, I just want to present this thought. So when we think about this, and again, this talks about the long-term relationship that we're building and a long time to get to a legacy gift. And there may be a thought, you're doing all of this for a revocable bequest, and in our quest for current revenue and getting ahead, it might be you're putting a lot of effort into a legacy gift. Well, if you ever run across that argument, or at least that feedback, I would answer this way. Start with the end in mind. Another great Stephen Covey quote. Because it's my position, I think position of a lot of other professionals, that if you get a written commitment for a future gift that's been developed around a donor's values and purpose and their expectations, you've just opened the door for a deeper engagement with that donor, and you also open the door for lifetime giving opportunities. So do not ever doubt the power of putting a legacy gift in place first, because I think that is just a great way to have that conversation, the continuing conversation with the donor down the road. So when we talk about long-term engagement, you can start with the end in mind and build that gift forward from there. So with that, that's enough of hearing from me and as a coach. I'm going to turn over to the team captain, Dahlia Pineda. And so I'm going to give you a few words about Dahlia. We had the good fortune to meet when I joined the Bauer College of Business back in 2016. And we had talked on and off before then, but sometime around 2017, I think it was, I had a donor who wanted to create a scholarship using gifts from a donor advised fund. And he had some pretty specific requirements. And Dahlia, who is heading up our MBA and graduate program admissions efforts, I needed to talk to her to figure out how we could do this scholarship the way the donor wanted. So in talking with Dahlia, getting to know her, I realized there was a curious chameleon sitting in front of me. She was great at adapting and thinking in terms of what the donor wanted to accomplish. So I knew at some point she should end up in fundraising. She should end up in advancement. So it took a while to convince her. She finally came over and joined the college as a director of advancement. And then about 6 weeks after she joined, I left to join Children International. So I've always apologized to her for that, but I think she's in a great place, and I think she's in a perfect place to talk some more about her experience. So with that, Dahlia, go ahead.
Thank you, Bob. And part of Bob's, I'll eventually let it go and get over the fact that he left after 6 weeks of hiring me, but he gets to click the slides for the rest of the presentation. He has control there. So you'll hear me say next slide, and it'll be with a little bit of saltiness there. But in any event, no, I'm appreciative to Bob for the opportunity. I am newer into philanthropy. I mean, I've been with the university almost 18 years, but I'm coming up on my 2nd year in advancement. It's been a great opportunity. When Bob approached me last year about this presentation that we presented at CASE actually a couple of months ago in January, I told people, yeah, Bob's doing a gift planning for dummies and I'm exhibit A, simply because this was the scarier part about fundraising for me. But of course I took the job because I thought, hey, if any of that comes up, I've got a boss who's a lawyer who knows all about this, right? And then he left. But we'll talk a little bit about resources and using what you have. And one of the things that I do want to share with a couple of the examples that I'll share here is the wins and the fumbles. You know, and I think it's important for all of us, if you're newer to fundraising or not, is to remember why you're doing what you do and the purpose. For me, that was the main reason I made the shift, was because I felt that I could serve the university that I love so much and have devoted my entire career to more deeply and more directly through you know, having more purpose, you know, and fundraising does just that. So and COVID-19, I know we have already addressed the elephant in the room, right? But it is a challenging time. Who knows what's coming? We can have ideas about it, but the reality is it's another opportunity. It's another opportunity for us to be creative and to help people help other people. So next slide there, Bob, we can keep going. As Bob gets over to the next slide there, we can, yes. So one of the things that I wanted to go back to, it's quite a few things, you know, to wrap in that Bob had talked about previously. But if you remember this slide where we talked about vulnerability and investors, those 2 words, be thinking about that as you move forward every day in conversations, be them gift planning or not. When it comes to vulnerability, it comes to long-term investors, the main point is relationships. Long-term relationships is what we're building with open communication. And, you know, I am a big believer in having to be real. What that means, you know, it means being competent. It means being confident. The world that I come from in marketing, I had to know my product really well. So for, you know, more than a decade, it was the MBA world and prospective students and corporate partners and hiring companies. What did they need so that we could produce that? So the feeling machines that think, we need to think about them as feeling machines that think and invest. And it's no different with donors. And the 2 examples that I'm going to highlight touch on just that. With planned giving, especially for me, again, I mentioned that's what I was most afraid of, and I thought that I had to know everything about it even before I took the job. That was one of the things that you know, this was the most terrifying for me about. And I was wrong. Of course, I didn't have to know everything. And depending on the structure within your organization, at U of H, we have a wonderful planned giving team headed up by, I'm sure she won't mind me saying her name, but Andrea Olsak. And she's been great. I've learned a lot from her. So I'm spoiled. We have a great planned giving team that supports all of the colleges. They're donor-centric, which means they're relationship-centric, and I'll give you some examples about what that means in a little bit. But one of the main things is that as a gift officer, you have to find your planned giving resources. If you're spoiled like me and you have a team that supports you in every single way, great. If you don't, you know, the presentations, the things that Bob just mentioned, that's one resource. And it's interesting because on the Curious Chameleon slide, you know, there is that don't take it personal, you know, with rejection. I see don't take it personal in a different way, right? I mean, anything with words, I'll always kind of look and try to see what else could that mean. As a new gift officer, I think that it's very easy to not share ownership of things. I heard it over and over, and now I know that after closing some gifts and things like that, no one person closes a gift. It takes a team of people. It takes a village. And for example, our planned giving team at U of H and some of the, especially one that I'll talk about that I'm working through right now, they are there as experts. They're there as experienced people who've dealt with these types of conversations, and they allow you to be donor-centric. So if you have a great team like that, congrats, high five, virtual high five. If you don't have a team or you're building one, I think one thing to ask them is how can we be donor-centric together? And if you stay donor-centric, I firmly believe that you'll always win for yourself and for your donor. And yes, I mean, I am a big believer in communication and how you communicate. And it's my MBA students, bless them because maybe they'll grow up, you know, or change careers. A lot of them are engineers and go be fundraisers because the examples I give them are, you know, when we talk about the communication model, what you send, what you get, the noise in between, how you're decoding messages, that's all what we do in fundraising, right? We're listening to everything, the noise and everything on top of it. So next slide, Bob. I'm going to talk about a couple, and this was my very first donor visit ever. I'm going to give you a little bit of an example of some missed cues there on my part. And I think that we should all remember our first donor visit. If you don't, you should. I think they're important to look back on because it shows you how far you've come. And then if you start seeing patterns within conversations, that shows you the type of fundraiser that you are. So I think that's really important. They were a really grateful couple. They were, you know, they give annually, and they were, you know, because of age and a few other factors, they were planned giving prospects. So I inherited, you know, a pretty big portfolio with people in all different types of you know, stages. And we did some visits. We got to know each other well. He did most of the talking usually, but it was the, you know, the husband and wife team. At one point, you know, I brought up, you know, the discussion about planned giving, if they had considered it, and they actually said, yeah, we're working on our will, what that looks like. You know, we talked about the university, if they had considered the university being part of that, and they said no, you know, they turned it down, and it was okay. You know, of course I wasn't, you know, you're not ever thrilled when you get rejected, but you know, they were still donors, so we still, of course, I stewarded them and we kept meeting. And when I checked on them in early March to see how, I usually spoke with him, you know, to see how they were doing, sadly, I found out that he had passed away. And she was really grateful for the check-in call. You know, we always talked every couple of months. And my heart just sank when she was telling me that he was gone. One, because, you know, it does hurt after you build relationships. And two, because they had no will. They never put it together. And then I realized the missed cues that I had. So I really want to be open about that. You know, I could have still been a resource. I could have still continued to ask how their planned giving was going, even though I was, you know, they had made it very clear that I would not be part of it or the university would not be part of it. And he always seemed uncomfortable to talk about the will, and she would want to chime in, but then it just wouldn't it wouldn't go in that direction. And I realized that if I had, come back, and I don't know if our gift planning team is on this webinar or not. I think they are, but she's probably gonna, smack me the next time she sees me. But you missed that opportunity. I missed the opportunity to come back and say, Andrea or somebody else, what do you think? This is what I saw. This is what I felt. And it could have been to where I could have gone back and made myself a resource for them, because at the end of the day, we need to remember what they still are, and they are consistent givers. They're your donors. They're part of your university family or your organization's family. So that's something that I learned from, I got to remember that I'm a conduit of goodwill, not just a closer. So I think that was earlier on. It was my very first planned giving conversation, and a couple of those flags were missed. She's still excited about giving in his honor. She's still excited about being part of the university in his honor, and we'll definitely take care of that relationship. But a couple of learning, things were learned there. So next slide, Bob. The next donor that I'd like to talk about is Lucy, and of course, we all know these are not their real names, but Lucy is a great, we have a great relationship. It's really been a privilege getting to know this donor. And very quickly on Lucy, it's a high 7-figure gift. Her and her husband had a scholarship endowment started a few years ago. He's the alum. He was the one who loved the university, wanted to repay the great education he had, received and the opportunities it built for him. And they were very clear about their plans for their estate and what they wanted, and how it was going to be part, for the university, for the college. After discussions began and were almost completed, he became very ill. She cared for him for a couple of almost 2 years of illness, and he passed away almost 2 years ago now. So only thing left was, for them to confirm the intention, right? To kind of get those things signed and all of that. We thought we were there at the finish line, or at the goal line. We're talking about football, right? We were not. So I inherited that account last year. And Bob, if you go to the next slide, this has really been a learning opportunity that I love to share with people. And if you remember, this is a busy slide, but I just shoved a couple of things in here. If you remember the why and the how, remember that these things are going to be tied to a person's emotions or feelings. And remember that we're talking about values. We're talking about the donor's vision for the future, the donor's emotions, the donor's feelings. I was discussing with our executive director of gift planning, Andrea, and I was talking to her about this whole situation, and she said this word that she, I didn't react too much because I want to be cool, but after I hung up the phone, I thought, oh my gosh, where have I been? Because she said she is grieving. There's grief, and this is why it's important to rely on your experts here. And what does it mean when someone's grieving? And I had to really think about that. The why and how that was built was her husband, not her, and he's not here anymore. And we need to remember that she's the donor now. So we have to remember that these are people, not gifts, that we are working with. I know it sounds so simple and so black and white, but it can so easily be missed as you're going through a journey sometimes. Everything needs to pivot whenever things change, and you have the chance to make it better. So this was my chance to be real, as we talked about, right? And build trust with Lucy. So next slide, Bob. If we just go back to, how it was a different kind of play. For Lucy, her husband passed away and the entire game changed. Okay, we had the opportunity to start over. When I inherited the account last year, I remember at the initial lunch, it lasted 3 hours, and she shared her feelings and was very direct. She was very direct that she didn't know details about the endowment. She didn't know details about what had been set up. So clearly I had to listen through the noise. She was being very direct. She gave me a gift. She was very direct. A lot of times as fundraisers, we have to listen through the noise and sift through the things. She was very direct in saying she didn't know what was happening. How could we expect her to sign anything else when she didn't know what was going on with the investment now? So fabulous opportunity. I asked her for permission to be her wing woman in this. We were going to empower her to make her feel like she really did own building his legacy. And she loved it. She cried and she said that that's exactly what she wanted. She wanted to build something in his honor because she missed him and she loved him. She's a new donor, and so we're building that with her. And to date, you know, a couple of things that I've done for that is bring her in. You know, you have investors, they want to see how the sausage is made up to a point. So she had never reviewed this endowment paperwork. He used to take care of all of that. We went through that. We've made some changes. You have to remind them, you know, that this could be our premier scholarship program that would be in his honor. And she got so excited and, you know, said that she'd never realized that. So we're in a great place. You know, as Andrea reminds me again, our director of you know, planned giving for the university, she wants to create organic connections. I don't know how many hours I've spent on the phone or in person with our gift planning director talking about this in terms of how do we connect her with people who've been in her same situation, et cetera. How do we make this a win for everybody? But all of this takes time, and that's exactly what you need to do. And hopefully you have a great team to support you there with that. You're inheriting a new donor sometimes with planned gifts. Remember that one person, if it is a couple, one person can pass away and you still have one new person. And maybe it was a different situation when they were there, just behaviorally. You know, when the spouse was there, they reacted and communicated differently. So definitely a lot of opportunities there. And next slide, Bob. So as we wrap up, you know, I wanted to just wrap together what Bob had covered, give you a couple of my examples, the learning process, at least that I've gone through. And I wanted to end with this in terms of purpose. You know, we do help people help others. That's a great purpose to wake up to every day. When it comes to gift planning, you know, we don't just help donors, we help each other in the field. So remember that. With your gift planning teams, with your mentors, you know, don't make something personal in the sense that it's all yours. It really does take a village. It takes an entire team every single time. And for those of you who are leaders in recruiting and retaining gift officers, talk to Bob. You know, after 16 years, he got me to completely switch to something different. And it's rewarding. I can't see myself doing anything else at the university now. But definitely help your gift officers every day see the purpose and the difference that they can make, especially in times like that we're in now, because it really is a privilege to help people help others. So.
All right, thank you so much, Dahlia and Bob. We have a few minutes left for questions. We have a couple that have come in. Feel free to send more in if you're so inclined. First, I just wanted to give you a compliment that you received from, let's see, who was it? Danielle. She said, oh my goodness, as a new MGO PPO, the way that this is being explained is so very helpful. Thank you. So thanks a lot, you guys. You've been doing a great job here. I wanted to ask Mary Kate's question first because she sent it in even before we started. So I wanted to get to hers. And she is wondering what type of conversations they should be having with their annuitants. She said they are communicating regularly with the donors during this pandemic, but she's wondering if there's specific messaging that should be conveyed to the annuitants other than just thank you and we're thinking of you. So Bob or Dahlia, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll go. Dahlia, do you want to jump in? No, I'll go ahead and take that one. We're talking about annuities. I think it's important to talk about, obviously, when we talk about them as a person, how they're doing, everything else that goes along with that. One of the questions that annuitants may be having in their mind is when they see, especially in tough economic times, they're like, well, is that going to impact my income stream? I think one thing you can talk to annuitants about is that, you know, how the annuity process works, that, you know, there's a stream of income, we've got that invested. You're trying to get them to really understand that there is, you don't want to say protection, but that income stream that they're relying on, that you're a strong organization, you're committed to honoring those, and that you don't, you know, you don't foresee a problem with gift annuities. You don't want to make any promises, but it's just reassuring that the organization's strong, where you have a plan for the future. you can gently open up that topic by saying, how are you feeling? Are you getting your checks on time? You still doing okay? That may open up the conversation. And if they don't want to pursue it, at least say, well, we're looking ahead to the future. We're making sure our commitments are solid. We're taking all steps that we need to. And so we just want to let you know that we thank you for being an investor with us through the gift annuity, and focus then on what you plan to do with that, with the remainder of the annuity later on, how that helps your general purpose, and again, kind of focus on the future of where that gift helps down the road.
And Bob, I'll jump in to kind of echo some of what you said, and just for Mary Kate, from what we're seeing with other folks and their communication with their annuitants. Again, a lot of people are feeling a ton of anxiety, the unknown, the uncertain, in a variety of different parts of our lives. Just reminding them, again, the thank you is critical for everybody, but reminding them the nature of that type of vehicle, and the fact that their payments are safe, their payments are going to be consistent, and that's exactly why part of the lure of that type of tool is to allow them to have that in perpetuity. So just again, kind of continuing to reinforce and support them because of perhaps some anxiety that they may be feeling.
Thanks, Nathan. We have a question from Rebecca. We're still kind of talking about messaging and communication, and she's wondering, you did mention the word investor quite a few times, and she's wondering if you actually use the word investor or invest when you're talking to your donors or prospects. She says she has heard that it can make things feel a little more transactional, moving away from the emotional side, but she's wondering your thoughts about that.
I'm happy to jump in on that one. So maybe for me, it's a little bit different. I will tell you this. I don't, I bring up that word, and I've used that word after I have gotten to know the donor better. And again, it all comes down to who your audience is, right? So in the business school, a lot of our donors, at least in my portfolio, do start the conversation in that way. So some of them do, depending on if it's our board members, et cetera. And then also the fact that for many of them, I've known them for years before I was in advancement, but I've worked with them, for a long time on many different projects. So but clearly that is a word, and you're absolutely right. That I think that is a word that comes in sometimes a little bit later, at least for me. And it's the type of donor, right? I'm trying to remember a webinar that I recently saw with our planned giving team, where it was, okay, what type of donor do you have? Some of them, if they throw out cues that they want to be treated as an investor, I think further on, I don't think you necessarily would call them investor, but you maybe respond to them and share information with them as far as an investment. But I would never ever take away from you're right, the thinking, that feels, never take away from the feels, in the sense that you never get out of the impact that they're making. And that's where the pragmatic side of it, I think, can come in. But Bob, I don't know if you want to add something to that.
No, I think you nailed it. It's you got to be comfortable introducing it, but when you focus on the impact, again, if they're comfortable with that term about impact, I think you've got an opening to talk to them like an investor and actually use that phrase and see if they like it. So.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there real quick too, because I think that's great, Dahlia and Rebecca, to your question. Some of this is also generational. A lot of us that have been in this industry for a while, very much have been working with silent generation donors and older donors that, trust charity and support on a broad scale, typically multiple charities in their plans. But more and more so, every generation wants to see where the dollars are going. So that investment side is becoming more prevalent. And, as you think about these types of gifts and, how large some of these can be, especially as it's related to a typical annual gift, it really is the largest investment they're making in your organization. And even the work Russell James has done that Bob alluded to earlier, seeing that people who have made a planned gift intention, typically their annual giving goes up. And part of it is because now they're more deeply invested in the work that you're doing. So again, a great question and great points. Just wanted to echo some of that.
Thanks, Nathan. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I did want to say that both Bob and Dahlia have offered their contact information. If you did have a question that you wanted to ask them, feel free to reach out to them. Their email addresses and phone numbers are on the screen right now. You can also reach out to Nathan or myself if you have questions about this webinar or any of the webinars coming up. You can jot down our email addresses, they're on the screen, and I'll also be providing the slides later this week. So that is all the time that we have today. A couple last notes is that we did record the webinar today, so barring any technical difficulties, the recording will be available on our website at stelter.com/webinars by the end of the week. I will be sending out an email to let you know when the webinar recording and the handouts are available on the website. So you can just look for that email from me, or you can just check in later this week and see if it's there. And that's all we have for today. So thank you so much. I think we had probably 750 of you on the line today. So we appreciate your interest in the topic. And Bob and Delia, we appreciate your expertise and taking the time to present this to the industry. Everyone, I'm sure, appreciate it very much. So thanks for spending your lunch hour with us, and we hope to see you next month for our next webinar. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.